Now, the Catholic Church has a Pope to make certain pronouncements. We Anglicans have an Archbishop of Canterbury. So when we need words from somebody that carry more weight than my words, for instance, I say, well, what does the Archbishop of Canterbury say about our next speaker this afternoon? And lo and behold, the Archbishop of Canterbury says that our next speaker this afternoon, certainly former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, describes our next speaker, Sarah Bachelard, as innovative, as lucid, and as sensitive. Oh. He also describes her as one of the great new voices in theological ethics. Somebody who has written great books that I must admit that I haven't been able to read the entirety of, but would love to sort of get my head to the point where I can. I think what Sarah brings to us today is somebody who has a depth of wealth of knowledge as a theologian and a Christian ethicist in a way. Somebody who has built up a community in Canberra as a contemplative church, the Benedictus Contemplative Church, which is an ecumenical community of faith that is one of the great new mission movements of the church, or certainly a part of it that I would say from my observations. And Sarah comes to us as somebody who reaches out of those traditions, looks into what's going on in the education space, and is really able to speak as a theologian into that space. So please join me in welcoming Sarah this afternoon.
Maybe not quite so lucid if Brad can't understand. And it turns out that my technical requirements have been the thing that stumped the organisation. What I required was a lectern to read my notes from. But so I thought if I stand there, you guys won't see me over there, so I'll sort of stand here and use the notes. So I'm sorry if that'll be a bit awkward. But my topic this afternoon is a spirituality of service learning. And a key focus for this conference is the awareness that's been growing, as we've been hearing over the past few years, of the shadow side of certain approaches to service learning. We've heard already that culturally insensitive, patronising and effectively self-serving programs may have significantly destructive impacts on the communities purportedly being served. A further and perhaps less discussed dimension of the shadow that may be cast by service learning is the sometimes debilitating impact on students of being regularly exhorted to make a difference, and so made to feel, in some sense, individually responsible for the world's transformation. It seems to me that the spiritual roots of both these potential pathologies of service are remarkably similar. And I thought if we began to tease them out a bit, we might be in a better position to conceptualise and develop approaches to service learning, a sense of the spirituality of service learning, which is more authentically life-giving for all involved. So I wanted to start by elaborating on what I've called the potentially debilitating impact of a particular rhetoric of service by drawing on my own experience. I went to high school at an Anglican girls' school in Canberra, and although in my day the concept of service learning was very embryonic, I certainly imbibed the notion that my life, particularly given the privilege of my private school education, should make a difference in the world. And this was what I wanted. This is what I wanted too. I wanted to serve, and I'm sure that's the case for many of your students. Later, I won a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford, which continued my formation in this vein, since Rhodes Scholars, so the brochures go, are distinguished by their commitment to public service and the common good. Now, all this looks, and indeed in many ways is, a good thing. It is true and life-giving to understand my life as indissolubly connected to the well-being of others. It does infuse my life with meaning and purpose, to know that I am both called and equipped to respond to the world's need. And yet, there was also something alienating and stultifying in the way I appropriated these seemingly altruistic and benign values, something that took me a long time to work through. In the years after school and university, I often experienced strong feelings of anxiety, inadequacy, and guilt. I couldn't bear to read the annual Rhodes Scholars Report because everyone, it seemed, was saving the world, except me, of course, and the same went for my grammar school report. I worked very hard to make a difference through bouts of activism and commitment to worthy causes, Bernardo's Kids Friends, companioning severely disabled children, campaigning for Amnesty International and working on its national executive, fundraising for homeless children in Iraq. And it felt good to be doing these things, to be caring, and while I was doing them, to feel my guilt alleviated. But at another level, I still felt I was never doing enough, and I remained overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task, with the result that these times of well-intentioned activity were generally followed by exhaustion and bouts of burnout. Implicitly, I realise now, I was trying to justify my existence by fixing the world. To whom much is given, much is expected. You know the line. Well, that was me. I had to make a difference, and the more spectacular, the better. Now, perhaps I was just a particularly earnest and angst-ridden young person who took a long time to find her vocation. I'm not claiming my experience is normative, but I don't think I'm alone. I share it for two reasons. First, I think we need to be aware that as taught to and received by students, the very rhetoric of service can contribute to their being alienated from themselves and their own deep calling. And relatedly, it can have the effect of alienating and isolating students from the world out there, the very world whose needs they're called to engage. Instead of seeing myself as part of the whole, a member of the family of things, it's as if my privilege and its attendant responsibilities subtly separates me from the mass. At worst, this leads to a kind of patronising noblesse oblige and a kind of cultural insensitivity and feelings of implicit superiority, however nicely masked, that we've been talking about. At the same time, perhaps this is the other side of this same dynamic, it can lead to a distorting and debilitating sense of being over-responsible and the anxiety of needing to do more, give more, and be more just to be okay. I know these are dangers, perhaps again particularly on the culturally insensitive side of things that you're all aware of. And I know many programs, I'm I guess most familiar with the one in Canberra at Radford College, work very hard to subvert the tacit assumption that service is about helping from the top down, the so-called privileged helping the so-called underprivileged. And the attempt to emphasise that true service is about working with rather than to or for. And at its heart is the experience of mutuality which connects us not only with others, but with who we ourselves are. But this can remain simply an abstract, sincerely held value. for it to become real for students, the place from which they actually live and serve, requires the cultivation of self-knowledge and authentic humility. And this gives rise to the questions that I want to explore and open up for our discussion today. How may students be inducted into an approach to service which reconciles rather than alienates them from themselves and from those they seek to serve? What framework and practices are required if schools are to develop a service learning curriculum that is life-giving for all involved? And so as we turn to these questions, I want to begin by reflecting in a bit more depth about the qualities of selfhood that are needed for true service. And this will repeat some things that we've already heard about. So this section is called Service and the Self. Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk, writer and peace activist, writing in the context of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, spoke of how the aspiration to serve must be connected to certain necessary qualities of the self. Anyone, he said, who attempts to act and do things for others or for the world without deepening their own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give others. No matter how sincere, they will tend to communicate only the contagion of their own obsessions, ambitions, and anxieties. In other words, whatever our values and intentions will not help, will not bring healing or enable justice when we operate from anxiety, rivalry, complacency, self-justification, and pride. These are the same pathologies that cause wounding in the first place. But what does deepened self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love actually look like? What are the particular qualities or capacities that need to be developed if we're to serve in truly healing ways? I want to highlight three. The first vital capacity is the willingness to be with another and to be with what is. Educationalist Parker Palmer tells a story of his experience of profound clinical depression, during which he suffered greatly from the responses of those who either avoided him altogether or well-intentionedly tried to fix him. One person who made a difference was Bill, his friend who found a way to be with him, alongside him in the darkness. Parker writes that Bill would visit to massage his feet each afternoon, rarely even speaking. He was simply there, present, neither evasive nor invasive. And that in time made the difference. Of course, this practice of being with doesn't mean we never seek to change things. But so often our desire to fix or make things better is actually a form of avoidance. We struggle to be present to the pain of what is. We're unwilling to be with the discomfort of our anxiety, our helplessness or grief. So we rush around trying to cheer people and implement premature solutions, masking our sense of powerlessness with activity. But the truth is, we cannot contribute to the healing of people, relationships, or the deepest of our world's wounds unless we are willing first to be with things as they are. How, for example, can we serve people who are grieving or dying if we refuse to be with, to let them be with the pain, anger, emptiness, and awkward questioning that comes with those experiences? Tolstoy's amazing little story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, portrays a dying man horribly isolated because those around him won't acknowledge what's happening and won't let him acknowledge it either. Seems to me that in our Australian context, we're slowly realising that true reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples calls not just for well-intentioned programs, but for our learning how to be with one another in unknowing and the pain of continuing irresolution and trauma. We know for ourselves when we've been badly wronged or hurt, what we crave most is acknowledgement and solidarity. And this kind of attentive presence is healing in itself. And similarly, those most attuned to the suffering of the natural world are recognising this need to be with the earth, to hear its cry, if healing at the deepest level is to happen. I have friends who have a disciplined daily practice of standing at the ocean's edge, letting themselves be present to the sea and their painful knowledge of its suffering. They will not evade this difficult truth, although they have no answers. That'd be a different kind of immersion. Being with the reality of another situation and our own is all about vulnerability. Letting go of control, letting go our agenda, and being open to what is. I think we know it when we do it. I feel it almost physically, like I'm sinking into the gut. It takes courage and patience. But when we dare it, something profound begins to happen. Our anxiety lessens. Our listening deepens. And with it, our capacity to respond. And this deep listening is a second essential capacity of selfhood if we're serious about service. And this is because responses that emerge from deep listening, from being honestly and non-compulsively open to what's there, are very different from reactions driven by anxiety and a need to reassert control. This is a deeper listening even than asking other people what they want. From this place of deep and patient listening, we're more able to discern the kind of speech or action that will truly communicate, will truly encounter, and truly serve. We let the situation itself suggest the way ahead, rather than desperately, often violently, imposing my will and preconceived ideas. And vital in this process, this deepened listening also enables me to listen for my role, our role, responsibility, or true calling. And I think that is vital for students. I remember in Year 10, when I was trying to choose subjects for my final 2 years, I was desperate to equip myself to be of service. Medicine seemed about the worthiest profession I could think of, so despite the fact that my real love was the humanities, literature and history, I thought I should choose subjects like chemistry, biology, and maths. It was very not me. Well, luckily for me, and doubtless for the world, my mother, who'd been listening to me for years, intervened. And she suggested I was more likely to be of real service if I trusted my love and my gifts. Unknowingly, she echoed the words of American theologian Friedrich Buechner, who says that true vocation is the place where your own deep gladness meets the world's deep need. I think the problem for many students, perhaps for us as well, is that in a world of such serious need, it's hard to believe we're allowed to be glad, let alone see it as intrinsic to our vocation. Especially when our passion doesn't seem to have any immediate utilitarian potential. Parker Palmer again describes his own journey with this difficult realisation. It began when he admitted he could no longer go on as a community organiser working in troubled American cities in the late 1960s. He found it difficult to come to terms, he says, with what he saw as this failure, but gradually saw how joy-sapping and self-defeating his commitment had turned out to be. I had been driven more by the oughts of the urban crisis than by a sense of true self, he said. Lacking insight into my own limits and potentials, I had allowed ego and ethics to lead me into a situation that my soul could not abide. The counterintuitive truth is that being in the world as a transforming and healing presence is not about adopting the noblest, most worthy-sounding work as one's own. Rather, it's about discerning the deep call on your life, your own deep gladness. Palmer writes, if I try to be or do something noble that has nothing to do with who I am, I may look good to others and to myself for a while. But the fact that I am exceeding my limits will eventually have consequences. I may end up doing more damage than if I had never set out to do this particular good in the first place. I think the truth is we don't always know how our vocation will contribute to the whole. How parenting these children, or working in this field, or creating this garden, teaching this room full of children, how it will make a difference. We just trust that, done with integrity, if it's mine to do, it will. I think of Michael Leunig, whose faithfulness to cartoons and simple poetry helps keep a government and a people honest. Well, who'd have thunk that? Which brings me to a third vital capacity of selfhood, non-attachment. Non-attachment is freedom from self-concern, self-obsession, self-indulgence. It doesn't mean being uncommitted, not caring how things turn out. But it is the freedom to work beyond ego without it being all about me or us, our image, our results. Of course, outcomes matter. It's not about going around doing, not caring about the impact of what we're doing. But the problem comes when we use our achievements as the prime indicator or justification for our worth. My life can be ostensibly about making a difference, yet if I'm honest, I'm still central to the picture. I'm using good works to justify myself, or make myself whole, or gain someone else's approval. Look at her, isn't she doing great things? But when I try to shore up my worth in this way, I have no freedom, and nor does anyone else. It's manipulative and alienating. It causes disillusionment and, again, likely burnout. By contrast, when I give myself joyfully to the work of my calling, and it's not all about me, there's surprising freedom. I'm graced with what's needed to keep going, even in the face of criticism or disappointment or failure. True service and self-forgetfulness always go together. So being with, listening deeply, non-attachment, seems to me these capacities of self are vital for service, which truly engages our world's need. And without these capacities, our well-intentioned efforts founder and even do damage. So if we're serious about forming students as agents of transformation, not only while they're at school, but for their lives, then these are the qualities that they and we and the world needs. So how do we nurture these ways of being in our schools? How might we foster these not simply as abstract values, but as part of each student's lived experience, as something they taste and can return to throughout their lives? Well, to be vulnerably with what is, to listen deeply and let go attachment to success, to live with this kind of freedom and openness to others. We need, it seems to me, to be connected to a basic experience of wholeness, a sense of peace about who we are. In theological terms, this is about the lived experience of communion and belonging, which enables the possibility of real humility, self-dispossession. We don't get to this place by being morally earnest, or even by committing to so-called Christian values. We get here by the lived experience of being held in and called by a gracious reality. That sense of, I am a member of the family of things. I'm free to be. And it's in the light of that kind of experience that we know ourselves and others as accepted, loved, okay. So what kind of service learning curriculum, what spirituality in the life of the school community would create an environment conducive to this encounter with wholeness and grace? And the ways of being that flow from it. Well, I just want to offer a few reflections, but I'm hoping that maybe that's something we can talk about together. I think that some kind of contemplative practice is important for cultivating these vital capacities of the self. And by contemplation, I mean in the first instance a practice of silent meditation or mindfulness. Meditation is a form of Christian prayer, though largely neglected in the Western Church until recently. It's being introduced to schools in age-appropriate ways in many places in Australia and around the world. Why is it significant? Well, it's a way of practicing, embodying the qualities of selfhood necessary for this transforming engagement. In meditation, we learn to be with God, ourselves, and with what arises, without attempting to fix or censor it in the first instance. So it cultivates our capacity to let things and people and ourselves be. By the practice of focusing on a single object, it cultivates attention, the preconditioning for deep listening. And during the time of meditation, we let go all thoughts, including our usual worries, plans, and obsessions. So it strengthens our capacity to let go self-concern, to practice non-attachment. And as we persevere, the practice of meditation leads us more fully into a sense of the gracious horizon of our lives. And over time, this does change us. You don't have to believe in it in order to be changed by it, which is a big advantage. We have a fuller sense of belonging. We experience a peace beyond our understanding, and so are liberated to love in liberating ways. In the practice of meditation, we encounter the reality to which the Gospel testifies. Reflection is another practice for nurturing the capacities of selfhood I've discussed. A gifted primary teacher I know begins each school day with a gathering circle. The children are invited to sit together, a candle at the centre. It's a non-anxious and hospitable start. The children are allowed to be and to share, if they wish, something that's going on for them. They're encouraged then to be in touch with themselves, to name their experience. My friend reports that this is challenging to sustain in a busy school context. And yet her observation is that it makes a profound difference to the quality of her class's learning and their relationships. So here's another practice that cultivates a deeper listening and the capacity to be with self and others. It attends seriously to the being of the children in the midst of the ever-present demands of a performance-oriented curriculum. As students grow older and participate in service learning programs, perhaps there could be opportunities for related approaches through spacious, non-accessible circles of trust. Students could be encouraged to reflect regularly over several years and not just a one-off Year 12 retreat. And in a safe context, to deepen self-knowledge by attending, for example, to their way of being with peers, or their relationship to leadership or authority, their feelings about aspects of their own experience and growth. I imagine students being offered opportunities to practice discernment of their passions and gifts. And similarly, the opportunity to engage in disciplined reflection in relation to particular experiences of service may help to deepen students' awareness of the assumptions and unconscious motives they're bringing to their engagement with others. Enable exploration of the challenge and complexity of deep listening, and cultivate students' capacity to be with unknowing and vulnerability. All these formative practices, meditation, reflection, discernment, they enact trust that if we take time to be present and attend, we will come closer to reality and be changed by it. So these approaches are profoundly faith-based. They're consonant with the gospel, but they don't just talk about this kind of reality and its values. They embody it and so enable access to it in lived experience. Service learning, which is embedded in and shaped by such a formative context, must be less inclined to unthinking paternalism and even exploitation, and also less inclined to alienate students from their own gifts and call. So I just want to conclude by mentioning two systemic questions which seem to be raised by this. Earlier I claimed that truly serving others is not about adopting the noblest, most worthy sounding work as one's own. It's about discerning the deep call on your life. And I've just spoken about the ways in which intentional practices of formation within a service learning curriculum might cultivate students' capacity for such discernment. I wonder, however, if there's a danger that the very concept of service learning contributes to confusion at this point. I note that the content of what we call service learning in schools seems primarily focused on service as practical help, as advocacy and activism. The paradigm of service, and I mean that in that broad sense we've been talking about, including solidarity and justice, but the paradigm is of taking overt action for social justice. But in our world, are not physicists and climate scientists among the most significant servants of humankind? Or those who can think critically and write creatively and so reimagine our world or reconnect us with others? And if that's so, why isn't doing science or literature or learning a language also conceived of as service learning? I understand that when everything is service learning, then in a sense, nothing is. I understand that having a particular focus on the notion of service tied to particular kinds of activities is an important way of inviting students to see themselves as part of a wider world in which they have a part to play. I guess I'm wondering, though, if we need to be aware of what gets labelled service and what doesn't, and perhaps the unintended consequences of that. So for me, leaving Year 12, doing medicine looked like service, and studying medieval history didn't, and that was a stumbling block for me. And this, I think, heightens the significance of the formation element in service learning curricula, since this may help students begin to relate to anything they might go on to do as oriented to the common weal, even if they can't immediately see how. So it's not even just connecting English into service learning because they write an essay about justice. You know, it might be they're writing a play which doesn't look like it overtly has anything to do with justice. We don't always see the connections immediately. So this kind of awareness of anything that they might go on to do as oriented to the common weal, as flowing out of deep listening and offered for love of the world. And second, it's the second systemic question. I think we need to be critically aware of the wider school context in which service learning is offered. I've sketched a spirituality of service learning, and suggested a number of practices that might be important. The difficult truth, though, is that the effect of these practices will remain limited if the rest of the school culture communicates something different. It's of little use telling students that the true horizon of life is gracious, whole-making, and non-anxious if the prevailing message of the system they inhabit is one of scarcity, competition, evaluation, freighted with expectations to do with achievement and securing the future. It's the whole context that forms and deforms, and the context is always exerting its influence. Schools, of course, are complex systems operating under great strain, with all kinds of external and competing demands, league tables, economic issues, pressure about results, demands of the national curriculum, ambitious parents, anxious children, it's all time poor. So, of course, it's an incredibly difficult, stressful environment, a whole system. But like it or not, these pressures also affect the classroom and the messages students pick up about what really matters, what really counts. We say we want to form students capable of transforming action and of true service. We want them to taste an experience of wholeness from which flow the capacities to be with what is, to listen deeply, and let go obsessive self-concern and attachment to success. If we're serious about this, a truly radical vision would be to create a more spacious, less driven culture in the whole school. And without this deeper cultural change, service learning programs are always in danger of being co-opted by anxious and self-oriented agendas, with schools jostling via their prospectuses for the most prestigious or exotic-sounding student service opportunities with, the attendant problems. And this suggests that perhaps one of the real services offered by a spiritually formative service learning curriculum will be to begin transforming the culture of our schools themselves.